Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And at request of some listeners in my Discord, I'm going to cover the work of Alfredo M Bonanno, um, who is an Italian insurrectionist anarchist who died December 6th of this year. This has been a hard year for the Italian old left, both the autonomous variety with Tronti dying and the insurrectionist variety with Bonano dying. Bonano, however, lived a long life. He died at the ripe old age of 86, so not bad. He was a longtime anarchist. He was imprisoned multiple times. I'll go into that a little bit. He was the editor of Anarchismo editions. And his work has not been super translated into English, even though he's engaged with people who are a lot more translated in English. He began as a insurrectionist anarchist, which emphasized direct action, informal affinity groups, and expropriation for financing anarchist activity, aka theft, which is what got him imprisoned a bunch. The insurrectionists were not aligned with the Synthesis Italian Anarchist Federation or with the platformists. And he actually called for all kinds of things. He was very, very active in the 70s and 80s. In 1993, he wrote a pamphlet called For an Anti-Authoritarian Insurrectionist International, which he proposed a coordination between Mediterranean and former Soviet and Yugoslav anarcho-socialists. He was arrested on June 19th, 1997, when Italian security forces carried out raids on all kinds of anarchist centers, actually. Hundreds were arrested that night. And they were following the bombing of the Palazzo Marino in Milan. Bonano was sentenced to 6 years in prison plus a €2,000 fine for armed robbery and other crimes. And then he was also sentenced another 1.5 years for publishing Armed Joy. He got out eventually. Then he was arrested again in 2009 with the Greek anarchist Christos Dragopoulos in Greece for suspicion of carrying out armed robbery. And he was denied entrance into Chile in 2013 for a bunch of conferences due to his stances on due to being arrested multiple times, as much as his stances on anarchism. He is interestingly one of the most prominent critics of national liberation struggles, and he thought that was really distorting the anarchist movement. In fact, he said that, quote, anarchists should refuse to participate in national liberation fronts. They participate in class fronts, which may or may not be involved in national liberation struggles. The struggle must spread economic, political, and social structures in liberated territories based on federalist and libertarian organizations. He rejected formal organizations in regards to affinity groups. It's not the kind of guy that I would necessarily always agree with, but he's an interesting thinker in the Italian milieu. We're going to read some very common theoretical errors, which was published in Sicilia. So the sottosviluppo e lotta de liberazione Nationale. Sicilia punto uno addizione. I don't speak Italian, so I hope that's close to correct. This is a text that's available by Elephant Editions. I will put the link in the show notes. This particular translation is by Jean Weir or Veer. I'm not sure if that's German or English. All right. Let's continue. Now let's get into Bonano. The exploitation of the working class comes in two precise ways, which link together through a complex system of complicity. The first is the direct one, carried out by the national bourgeoisie. The second is an indirect one, exercised by the bourgeoisie of other nations. Such a reparation, however, is not based on any ethnic concept of nation. Internal exploitation is not carried out by the national bourgeoisie in the role of ethnic representative of power, but as political representatives of the managerial centers of centralized power. In other words, in all the states that exist today, in Europe, for example, come from a primitive and preponderant nucleus, which has gradually, throughout history, ended up including and dominating the politically and military weaker peripheral nuclei. So we hear Bonanno actually accepting a lot of the frameworks of world systems theory. He uses a slightly different metaphor here, the nucleus and nuclei, but we have the core and the periphery here pretty clearly. In Spain, it was Castile which put this into effect. In France, the North subjects the provinces to the south. In Great Britain, the English subject the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish. In German, it was Prussia who carried out the task, subjecting the smaller Germans, Danish, and Polish states, and even provinces such as Alsace-Lorraine, the objects of English arguments with France. The same phenomenon had occurred in Russia. The Great Russians dominated the Romanians, Finlanders, Lithuanians, and Poles. In Austria, a group of coalized Germans imposed dominion on the Greeks and the Slovaks, the Magyari, the Poles, and the Italians, at least until 1918. The process of the formation of large modern states was thereby being characterized by a series of external impositions. Ethnic unities are destroyed, obliged to submit to administrative civilization, and therefore the exploitation worsens. This is Varn talking. I would love proof that centralization actually increases exploitation. I suspect that's true in some cases, but I would like proof that's true in all. The process of the formation of large modern states has therefore been characterized by a series of external I just read that. Ethnic unities are destroyed, obliged to submit to administrative centralization, and therefore exploitation worsens. This is not the kind of conclusion reached by the Marxists. They, on the contrary, think that the function of the monarch of the absolute states has been progressive. Right, Engels writes, once the borders have been formed between linguistic groups, it was natural for them to provide the basis for the formation of states and for nationalities to begin to develop into nations. The rapid collapse of a state with mixed ethnicity, such as La Guarnia, shows the importance of these elements already in the 9th century. It is true that the medieval period was far from the linguistic and territorial confines coinciding. Yet, each great nationality, with the exclusion of Italy, was represented in Europe by a particular state of considerable and increasingly clear and conscious extension. No, it wasn't. You have to, for this to be true, you have to accept Engels' notion of historical peoples, which is a whole problematic thing. This is Varn talking and commenting on Engels' stuff that's often dropped. And the tendency to create national states in the medieval period constitutes one of the most essential instruments of progress. F. Engels, unter der Verfall der Feudalismus und das Aufkommen der Bourgeoisie. In Marx Engels Werke, Volume 21, page 395. Cited by Fescia in Il Marxismo, Milan, 1970, Volume 3, pages 62 to 63. That's a fair point. And this is a point that even modern Marxists don't pick up on today because it's hard to justify some of the opposition to imperialism with this view of the development of national states. In opposition to these theses, Kropotkin writes, no matter how developed the state on the model of the imperial Rome violently put it in to all institutions of mutual aid of the medieval times, this new aspect of civilization cannot last. The state, based on a vague aggregation of individuals and only ties of union, does not actually achieve this end. The tendency to mutual aid breaks down bronze laws of the state. Peter Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, and Bakunin wrote, these precursors, the weakened states, must understand that their weakness was in the past, and their incapacity to form a state constitutes strength today. Their right to a future and gives a meaning to all present national movements. M. Bakunin, State and Anarchy. The reactionary and centralizing function of the emergence and reinforcement of the powerful state is very clear in the situation in which Sicily finds itself. At the moment that passes from the Bourbons to the Piemontes, there was an incredible increase in fiscal pressure. From the total land tax passed from 50 to 70 million in 1866, where the center and the north paid 25 million between them. The sale of the ecclesiastical goods brought a unitary state about 6 millions. Yet there was more public spending in the north than in the south. The unitary state spent about 90 million in Lombardy for hydraulic works and 1,323 million lira in Sicily. The national pro capita average of these costs 19.71 lira, whereas in Sicily is only about 0.37 lira. Much has been said about the great expense of the railway in Sicily. In the period between 1861 to 1898, about 470 million were spent, while over the whole national territory, the investment was 4,076 million lira. This is why I'm talking. I think this is actually very fascinating because it does point out the core periphery distinctions in states and how this is ignored by Marxists all the time in ways that also annoy me, a Marxist. Particularly when people complain about, like, for example, the amount of, say, tax expenditures that goes to, quote, red states, mostly either in the terms of farm stabilization or actually in military aid. Military aid shouldn't be called aid, it's military spending in those states. Which is theoretically to benefit the entire country. What isn't looked at is the net drain of resources from those areas. You're just looking at tax receipts, which liberals like to do. Liberals like things that are easily on spreadsheets and like to come up with vast over conclusions from them. But if one looks at, for example, resource extraction from a lot of these periphery states and not just tax receipts in and out, the entire spectrum becomes different. And of course, we don't do that. Now, in the case of something like Sicily, there's all this complaint about the cost of the south to the north, and yet it's pretty clear that actually more tax farming was actually going on in the south than in the north of Italy in the 19th century, and that the south was getting less of it, but they were always being scapegoated as complaints for the cost of spending. Furthermore, another point that Bonano is making that's actually pretty true is that almost all national projects involve an external, aka an imperial or settler-like movement of peoples, and you can't get around that. And one of the things that Marxists, at least according to Bonano and anarchists, black it out is what that's actually meant and done. So should Marxists be pro-imperial? Well, clearly some Marxists at least flirt with it and hide that they are. Anyway, the problem of national liberation as such cannot be understood if it is not placed from the perspective of double exploitation. If one loses the thread when speaking of the local bourgeoisie because it finds itself acting on an ethnic basis, the sense of class struggle is lost from the frying pan into the fire. Yeah. It is not at all true that local bourgeoisie make fewer claims than external ones. This is aimed at Maoists for those who aren't picking this up. And the Maoist paradigm is dominant today, even in liberal circles. That, local comprador, local non-comprador bourgeoisie are better than external ones. The whole of the bourgeoisie is the same. The class homogeny of the exploited cannot destroy itself starting on a separatist concept. One must instead insert oneself within a revolutionary optic, reestablishing the general principles of class struggle that comes from the base, a struggle against the exploitation that's carried out in the name of the people, not in the name of an external and indigenous caste. By condemning the whole of the bourgeoisie and all aspirations of power of the restricted minorities, by condemning any discourse that intends to pass over the heads of the exploited, by condemning any decision that concerns the stages of revolutionary process and the double dealing of those who claim to accept compromises that cannot be maintained, interests that cannot be paid, and commitments that cannot be honored, we condemn any deformations of the national liberation struggle, a struggle which must assume an internal matrix. There can be no contradictions between these two perspectives. National liberation struggle becomes a bureaucratic banality, a bloody executioner in the name of the pot-bellied bosses who stay in the comfort of their armchairs because of horrible misdeed carried out at the cost of the people. If it is not within this context going towards a proletarian revolutionary nationalism. Once one accepts the thesis that the internal bourgeoisie is just as contrary to the true interests of the people, as well as any external one, which the enemy called opportunist in order to confuse the ideas, one must also accept that the proletarian isolation of liberated ethnic nucleus is revolutionary suicide. Its gaze must necessarily towards the outside, on the pain of death of the revolution itself. Any revolution today that intends to pace itself on a autarkic basis, if not economic, at least political and of convenience, is unthinkable. Once it's clarified, there remains another problem of where to address one's gaze. I actually agree with Varn with this. This is Varn talking again. The idea of these liberated autarkies that are post globalization decoupled and can just act on their own, that's just, it's going to automatically lead to another imperial power contestation. And you can have multiple nationalities facing that in a more fair way and dividing power up in a more fair way. Sure, absolutely. There are ways in which a nonviolent multipolarity could be established, but it's highly unlikely. And the idea that that will automatically create the conditions for a third world proletariat or any proletariat to necessarily thrive, frankly, it's not even logically consistent. Why would that? Because you have many separate powers holding people down and you can play them off of each other to get ahead. Why would you think, however, that the bourgeoisie and their states would necessarily get along that cleanly? That's foolish. Anyway, once one accepts the thesis that the international bourgeoisie is just, oh, I read that. The revolutionary movements and organizations of the proletariat of the dominant countries cannot immediately be taken into consideration. Most of the European countries, plus the USSR, the United States, and China, cannot be taken into consideration because they are too much involved in surviving a situation of terrible repression, are engaged in trying to find or regain their true identity in a situation that is dispersive or continuing changes. Then there are the revolutionary movements and proletarian organizations of the countries where there's already a reasonably effective national liberation struggle in course. Some European countries, some Arab countries, some Latin American countries. If our interlocutor remains the revolutionary proletariat of the whole world, the revolutionary proletariat for their own national liberation can be considered a privileged interlocutor. The line of interpretation is beyond discussion to us. Starting from the possible to develop an organizational proposal based obviously on the presidential struggle against the internal and external bourgeoisie. This discourse must be in the logic of federalism, something that Marx hates. That's Barn talking. It must be from the base and take account of the small local communities coordinated together with a view of production and administration. The future aims of free community and those organizations freely in federations, such as those in the course of liberation struggling to create organizations that we can define self management must be. Complete restriction of an integral perspective that makes the individual the basis of society. In the perspective of contributing to the clarification of some of the questions relative to the national liberation struggle more concretely, we must look at some of the problems that are raised more frequently by the adversaries of this revolutionary project. One, a country that is economically dependent on another cannot be politically independent. This is a common misconception even amongst revolutionary comrades who accept the project national liberation struggle, in part at least. These comrades insist on the fact that it is in perspective it is necessary to reinforce an economy of a country or a part of a country in order to improve the process of separation in the course of accelerating elements which completely are in favor with the split. This was the kind of mistake Marx made when writing to Engels when he rejoiced at the victory of Bismarck under the illusion of reinforcing the German natural bourgeoisie. The Prussian meant a parallel reinforcement of the proletarian organizations, which Marx did do and was wrong about. That is not what compelled the creation of the All German Workers' League by Lassalle or whatever else. One of the things that Marxists tend to do and focusing on the theoretical writings, or maybe even sometimes the journalistic writings, is ignoring the letters where Marx actually makes predictions that don't pan out. And everybody makes predictions that don't pan out. If you were to read my work, there's plenty of that too. And I'm not saying here to disparage Marx. Obviously, I'm a Marxist, but there are things in which Marx is wrong, objectively and undeniably so. They're particularly clear in the letters, and we often ignore them. And these are things where Marx was wrong in his lifetime, or where he took a strong stance and backed down in his lifetime. All right. In the situation, such as the present one in Sicily, clearly dependent on the Italian market and through it the international one, no national liberation perspective would be possible if this thesis were valid. In fact, reasoning this way, we would find that neither the Sicilian bourgeoisie or the proletariat would be interested in their liberation. The first, because they are economically linked to the Italian bourgeoisie, and the second, because they can only be liberated at the same time by the Italian proletariat. If there might be some foundation for this position as far as the Italian bourgeoisie are concerned, as it could not accept its own self-negation, only being available for the clash in the hope of managing to impose its absolute dominion. It is not valid for the Sicilian proletariat, which could lay the conditions for the future liberation of the Italian proletariat starting from its own liberation, but not vice versa. The unity of the Italian and Sicilian proletariat is not denied by the national liberation struggle of the former, but it is reconfirmed in the future perspective of the liberation of both. The same cannot be said for the Italian bourgeoisie, which realizes more easily, free as it comes from the illusion of nationalist ideology, the difficulty of formulating a relationship of collaboration with a future dominant national bourgeoisie. The fact that political self-determination of a country puts it into a process that are very difficult to manage for the revolutionary proletariat is another problem. This re-enters a more general question concerning the proletariat's need or not to participate in a partial economic or political revolution and to try to impose within the capabilities of its own strength the social revolution. Two, the nation is essentially a cultural phenomenon. The problem is reduced to spiritual element alone, denying the legitimacy of political self-determination. Many states are quite obviously underlying the ethnic characterization that distinguishes individual social groups. The division into regions of the Italian state responds to the needs of the subordinate way, but corresponds to primarily to ethnic differentiation. The fact that one insists so much on one's use of local languages and that it is the Italian state itself that is financing research and the Sicilian chairs are elements of a larger mosaic where the dominant state wants to enclose the basic need for liberation, so to speak, Sicilian and Sicily, and why not German interests and Bonano, so the exploitation can continue. The local bourgeoisie tightens its agreements better with those at the national level, satisfying its own nostalgic stimuli of disunto nationalism, while the proletariat amuse themselves with sentiments that flatter them and continue to suffer under the yoke of the bosses. If the nation were only a spiritual and cultural fact, The most one could ask of the forces available for national liberation struggle in Sicily would be that of fighting for a better and more recent and complete editions of the best Sicilian Italian dictionary available. But this is not how things stand. To an ethnic unity of a cultural and spiritual nature, there corresponds a precise political dimension, and the limits of which this dimension turns out to be an element of, coagulation of the revolutionary forces is the interest of the proletariat, and it's always exploited, engaged themselves to reach local consequences, those of the economic and political revolution. It is up to all revolutionaries in the course of struggle itself to bring about the conditions necessary for the development of social revolution. Here, I think Bonano is actually making a point I make, that multiculturalism is always necessarily facile in a place like Canada where it's really celebrated, because any cultural elements that are truly a danger to, and cultural is vague, and I go into that all the time. I'm frustrated about the way people use it, but cultural elements that are truly a danger to, liberalism are not actually tolerated that much, or they're totally isolated. Like you can have that in your small Amish farm or your First Nations lands, but you can't have that anywhere. Error number C: national liberal struggle is outdated. According to this commonplace, every organization of struggle for the national liberation is enveloped in the real field of class struggle, remaining tied to anachronistic ideals typical of the reactionary petty bourgeoisie. This used to be my stance. I'm just not going to lie. An objection that fails to grasp the contradictory aspect of the situations, which precisely to ethnic unity is calculated by the domination that is substantively foreign. The acceptation of such a thesis is equal to the opposite one, which maintains that all separation is revolutionary. All separatism is revolutionary, even though the nostalgic and really anachronistic one of national bourgeoisie. What counts in the reality of the struggle is precisely the contradiction of the interests and differences between the weighting of various social groups and the true possibility of realizing it. Each national liberation movement is therefore characterized by a double aspect. It has a revolutionary potential and an anachronistic reactionary residual. The first is incarnated in the capacity for proletarian struggle, the second in the managerial claims of the bourgeoisie. This is in itself a result of class struggle, which has turned out to be a continual state of modification. However, it can neither be sanctified on the altar of revolutionary glory nor thrown into the mud and dust of reaction. To say that it is only one of these two characteristics, which is characterized as national liberation movement, is the means to suppose that a stable alliance is possible between the revolutionary proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In fact, it means to give as possible a blind interclass collaboration, when instead reality continually shows the contradictions are always at a boiling point. This, I think, is fundamentally true. That there is a real revolutionary spirit to national liberation, but there's also a reactionary consolidation of peoples that requires an establishment of a dominant culture, which requires an administrative establishment, which requires a bourgeoisie collaboration, and which, even in using the revolutionary potential of national struggle to gain recognition, is a bourgeois international cosmopolitan power recognizing another bourgeois member. So the legitimacy of nationalism here is a bourgeois legitimacy. But that's why everyone appeals to it, because our international order is fundamentally about trade and thus fundamentally bourgeois. If you don't understand that, you cannot understand that, like, multipolarity, unipolarity, etc., does not actually fix these problems. In many ways, it's time for you to think through the implications of what you're saying. All right. D. National liberation is the need of the bourgeoisie alone. Another serious mistake. This is the thesis supported by Kautsky. Quote, the capitalist class will equip in its interest those of the entire nation. The higher surplus value of the capitalists of a nation, the greater the prosperity the nation is in our eyes. For them, patriotism means pursuing the interests of surplus value as the exploiters of the nation's pocket. They do not intend as such a dedication to the homeland, sacrifice of goods and blood, so much as the exploitation of the homeland, which should enter the fields of gods and blood of their popular massed to protect profits of the capitalists abroad. The homeland does not exist for the people so much as the popular masses exist for the homeland. Karl Kautsky, Patriotismus und Sozialdemokratie. Patriotism, Social Democracy, Leipzig, 1908, pages 8 to 10. I do like how Bonanno actually cites well and cites stuff that's not commonly brought up in contemporary debates. He clearly knows his Marxist historiography, even if he isn't one. And continuing in harmony with the Marxist thesis of consolidation of the state as the anti-room of the worker, consolidation continues. Bourgeoisie and proletariat have the same interest in eliminating the feudal splitting up of the nation into small states and statelets, and reunifying all elements that live in the same territory and speak the same language into one national state, since thus reunification represents an enormous progress in respect to breaking up and an important condition for the development of productivity of work. IDM, page 12. It is a question of positions that do not take into consideration the concrete relationship that passes between the self-determination and the real context of class struggle. So doing one can reach the conclusion that as a phase with the clear political matrix, self-determination represents only utopian exegesis that the retrograde dreamers carry on, not realizing that the advanced capitalism has already gone beyond the national principle in instances. Once this era does not recognize the active and determining role of the proletarian struggle, political self-determination, the recognition of the necessity of national liberation are not only a vague utopian dream of the bourgeoisie, but also a sentiment that is strongly felt by the proletarian strata. Now, if the bourgeois class, this statement is nourished, which projects this translation is probably not ideal. Anyway, now if the bourgeois class, here we go. Now, if in the bourgeois class, the statement is nourished with projects of dominion that are in fact utopian, when considered separately in a perspective of advanced capitalism, the same sentiment in the proletarian class is extremely realistic as it's able to construct precisely the moment passions to spark that unleashes the condition of a revolutionary clash. That does not mean, especially in Sicily, that one does not have to take into account the so-called retrograde dreamers. Here the latter are oriented towards a general and innocuous, for them, parasitical progressivism, and therefore energetically block any struggle that moves the proletarian base. The Communist Party and the recent radical forces fascinate them and condition them. They represent the alibi of the landowning industrial bourgeoisie, doted with other means, but with another mentality. They reflect a reality that is split in two. They cannot be passed as unitary, and therefore they're quite far from homogeneity. In practice, it is not possible to carry out a political cultural discourse that takes the account of the economic economy that supports the contrast of development under development. For this reason, the reality of those who live in hardship of the underdevelopment is determined not only by what it represents as a specific situation, but what it represents for all, including those who live in contact with structures that are open to the project of development. Certainly, through these experiences, if they were carried out through an intelligent diffusion of ideas, a change in some of the attitudes held by many comrades who are not in the habit of considering poverty of the South as a root of the cause, not simply the effect of the industrialization of the North, of the so-called major democracies of some privileged regions. But this fact alone is not enough. It is necessary to be clear that for the poverty of the South to correspond with the wealth of the North, the old lifestyle in feudal setting of the South corresponds to the dynamic modern life of the North. The underdevelopment of the South is linked by inextricable logic to the development of the North, the logic of capitalism. In order to exist, in fact, the capitalist still today, the most national era needs the existence of an underdevelopment to use in the colonial sense of the term. AKA, there is an internal periphery which national unification does not undo. In fact, it in some ways hides and worsens, and that Kautsky and other Marxists who ignore this due to their great peril. But it does actually point out that there's real material programs here other than just ideology. The international game of imperialism does not impede the local game of old-style colonialism, and then since the South pays the cost of the North and the work for the enrichment of the latter. It seems obvious to us more than ever that the improvement of living conditions of the Sicilian proletariat and of the South in general will not be possible if not breaking definitively the relations of development, underdevelopment, and restoring a new logic of a revolutionary kind. Even the Sicilian dreamer can insert himself in the perspective, denouncing the substantial function of the break and support of the power that more fortunate dreamers, acting in the privileged areas of the industrial north, volenti or nolenti, conscious or unconscious, accomplish. The filter of culture weighs down on any possibility of ransom of the South, adding to another reactionary force to find great space and great support there, fascists, the mafia, and the like. E. The era of reactionary nations. The theory of reactionary nations. A strange mistake that often comes back into fashion, which has produced breakdowns in the past. Often many comrades, although denying it at a theoretical level, manifest a new kind of visceral reaction against some nations that are seen as reactionary as such. You see this today when people, this is where I'm talking, complain about Poland, or the way Marx complained about Serbia. Anyway, the most common example of this mistake is made by comrades who support struggles the theoretical position of some ethnic groups, such as blacks in the Americas, the Palestinians, the Catholics in Northern Ireland, for the averse groups, white Americans, Israeli Jews, English Protestants in Northern Ireland immediately become examples of reactionary nations. Engels spoke with great contempt of peoples without history and condemned the nations to hard condemned the nations to hard slavery, at least until the revolutionary liberation that it was necessary to reach through the great nations that centered with strong workers' movements. But Kuhn, on the other hand, looked with sympathy towards the weak nations because he saw them as precursors to the liberation of tomorrow. I'm going to have to do something on Engels and Marx and the historical peoples stuff, because that stuff is problematic and people ignore it. And while Marx did complicate it in his ethnological notebooks at the end of his life, which seems to indicate that he abandoned a lot of it, it's a big problem. And it's also why there's not a consistent early Marxist take on nations. You have to go to Lenin for all that. And part of the reason why is they don't want to deal with the Hegel, historical peoples distinction. But anyway, he wrote famous, he being Bakunin here, wrote this famous passage of State and Anarchy. The Slav persecutors must finally understand that the time in which one could play innocently at the Slav theology is over, and that nothing more absurd and at the same time more nefast, more mortal for the people than making the pseudo principle of nationality the idea of all popular aspirations. Nationality is not a principle that is common to all of humanity, but is a historical fact limited to one district, a fact that is undoubtedly, like everything that is real and inoffensive, the right to see oneself recognized by all. Every nation, even the smallest, has its character, its way of living, of expressing itself, of feeling, thinking, acting. And it is this character, this way of being, that's precisely the essence of nationality, the product of a whole historical epoch and the whole conditions of the existence of a people. Different, on the other hand, the Marxist position of Engels. The European significance of a people, its vitality counts for nothing from the point of view of the principle of nationality. For such a principle, the Romanians of Wallachia, who will never have had their own history nor do the energy to make it, count on the measure of the Italians by the bimillennial history and unconsumed national energies. The Welsh and the inhabitants of the Isle of Man would have, had they so wished, and absurd as it may seem, the same right as the English to an independent national existence. The whole thing is an absurdity wrapped in popular clothing, throw smoke in the eyes of naive people that one can conveniently use slogans to throw aside according to circumstances. It's precisely this typical era of the reactionary nation that alimented the whole question of the so-called Manifesto of 16. The editorial group of the Temps Nouveau split in two groups from the beginning of 1916. The situation in Paris with the whole of the French and the international anarchist movement became hot. The 14th of March, La Bataille, published in the manifesto of signed by 15 people. The 16th was the Nigerian locality of Hussein mistaken for a militant. Among the names were anarchists who were known all over the world: Grave, Mileto, Porot, Paul Reclus, Kornezden, Cherhezov, and Kropotkin. In his document, it was said, among other things, quote, with those who are struggling, we consider that, unless the German population returning to a more sane proposals of justice and right renounce all serving any longer an instrument in the project of pan-German political domination, it is not possible to talk of peace. A front contrary to this position was formed immediately. From London, Malatesta replied to the piece with entitled Anarchist in Government. Error F. The national liberation struggle necessarily froze into a political revolution precisely because it is a question of political demand. Another error that is due to Marxist determinism. As in the case of the first of the mistakes considered here, that is where a country that is economically dependent on another cannot be independent. This affirms that a struggle for political self-determination necessarily remains within the economic framework that it characterizes it. We must not forget that anarchists, we participate in all struggles for freedom, so long as they have the essential characteristic of the insurrectional struggles of the base. That is, to see the president and masses along with the action of the Materian revolutionary groups, the programs that are politically and ideologically differentiated, but are sufficiently clear as to have no doubt of their aims. We cannot, as we have often maintained, reserve our intention to only struggle guided by anarchists to the struggles that we are supposed to have sufficient percentage guarantees of victory. The struggle develops in the struggle. It is never a static model that reproduces itself mechanically and always in the same way. Our very presence, often within these struggles that start very far from the anarchist objective, can cause modifications, such as to consent to a considerable approach to the revolutionary objectives of anarchism. Now, the struggles for national liberation have precisely the structure. They are strongly contradictory. They present elements that would have been better if they had not existed, but they do exist, and there is no pious intention, and no pious intention can exclude. If anarchists want to be purists, let them be so. But with revolutions have never been made with purism and the candid exhibition of their own ideological uprightness. Even less have insurrections been realized. To fight on all possible occasions, so the best conditions possible for popular mass insurrection to be realized, as far as possible self-managed, is the fundamental task of the anarchist militants. And national liberation struggles has many possibilities of setting out in insurrectional directions, which is Bonano saying that while we should not be tied down by national liberation struggles, you can't ignore them. Now, I read this because it's interesting, as a critique of a lot of Marxism, how close Bonano is reading Marx compared to a lot of Marxists today who don't seem to have read Marx hardly at all. There are assumptions here, like that federalism is necessarily going to be the fairest way to handle this, that small groups of peoples that have a common history and language should be considered like natural, translocal, even like groups of revolutionary management. The insurrection is the best way to do it. I would question the latter for sure. But there's a lot of very rigorous thinking through of the contradictions of nationalism and the way it is necessarily class collaborationist. It's interesting. I covered Daniel De Leon's groups, the Socialist Labor Party's interpretation of the letters of Marx, what we now call the Critique of the Burger Program or the Draft Program letters, or whatever you want to call it. Different people insist on different things. Where the SLC says, the mistake that Marxists made was in Germany and applied elsewhere was not letting the bourgeois revolutions happen in feudal eras of their own accord, and thus joining with them with the national bourgeoisies, which according to De Leon were progressive and good, but mixing the socialist future with them muddles the question in a way that destroys any kind of party theoretic unity. Now, De Leon was an uber sectarian, even by the standpoint of sectarians, but there is an interesting insistence there. Whereas this is sort of saying, like, I have to take that, in Sicily and a lot of places, national liberation struggles are going to emerge. We should be very careful about standing with them, but we shouldn't try to pretend they don't exist or can stand completely outside of them. All right. And what's interesting is that's very close to my own position these days. That most national liberation struggles have an internal colonial character, even when they're not like clear, obvious minority groups like there is in the U.S. That you know, other nationalities posited by people like Jay Sakai or other groups actually just assume national interest in like racial categories or whatever without common languages, religions, and whatnot, which is normally part of the definition. They do that because if you don't do that, you have to deal with the ugly part of national consolidation within those groups, which in the case of people being opposed by settler colonialism is a mutually constituted problem. Meaning, for example, the Nigerian liberation movement and the concept of Nigeria exists solely because of colonialization and imperialism. Then it becomes something which you can either use, a la Chinua Achebe, or some of the more radical African decolonial theorists who said that the concessions to nationalism was accepting a European framework. Bonano is kind of taking a similar stance, but pointing out that's true even in Italy or Spain or in the US, even. That these things are going to happen. There's cores and peripheries, and there's internal ethnic tensions, not just racial tensions, but also regional ones, and that are very real, and they have a material basis. And yet, if you sign up with them, you're basically signing up to a class collaborationist project, which ignores that that the local bourgeoisie is not ultimately in proletarian favor either. And what Bonano seems to be countering is both a sort of like a digging your hand into your sand about national liberation, but also the Maoist modality, which is common, I think, in the U.S. today across the spectrum. I think factually you see it more amongst non-Marxists than Marxists. Just take nations as like a given. When local reform movements fail, that's tend to be what they turn to. And so you turn back to the national object, which is usually someone else's national liberation, which you have no control over and very little influence over, except maybe changing your own government's funding. And using that as a projection upon your own action. But that's actually proof of your own domestic failure. I will include the link to this version of the text in the show notes. Like and subscribe if you want more. We have a Patreon. I'd like to thank my recent Khan El Kahanan patrons. There are some new ones, and I need to give them their shout outs, as is the rules. I might be restructuring, not the pay structure. I think for now, 3, 5, and 10 is fine, but I may be changing what you get for those amounts. But the $3 will always get you audio of everything important anyway. That is a commitment I have to A, make a lot of stuff free on YouTube, B, produce a free interview podcast for everybody in the interworld, and then 3, additional stuff and audio form being made available for fairly cheap, and additional videos and other things that you can get, you pay for. It's a model. I don't monetize this YouTube, for example, because I just don't want to deal with the complications of that. But it's a model I think really does help keep this program somewhat honest. All right. It doesn't look like I have any shout out after all. All right. Well, thank you. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. We'll be doing more text. You see me do MMT text. I'm doing anarchist text. I'm doing Marxist text. I'm also doing Annihilate Down, one on theory of hermeneutics. And that'll be a series that I'll do sporadically. I have 2 episodes planned, but there's going to be more needed overall. And a long series on the meaning and usage of critique of the Goethe programs, as well as the debates about how it's used today. Going from, at least so far, I'm going to go through Daniel de Leon, Lenin, and Korsch, and then we'll get into like contemporary debates about it. I also need to talk about the Maoist use of it, both in Mao's period and in Deng's period. There's a lot on the of unpublished fragments. That text ends up being super important, and I'll be going through primary source documents and secondary source documents to argue with them in many cases. But so you can get firsthand the development of the tradition. All right. Well, I hope you like this diversity of literature. Thank you. Hit the bell.